The desert floor trembled beneath Captain Maya Phoenix Rodriguez as she pressed her body against the scorching metal of her F-22 Raptor, 30,000 feet above the chaos unfolding in the valley below. Through her helmet's heads-up display, she could see them 12 Army Rangers pinned down behind crumbling concrete barriers, their ammunition running dangerously low as enemy forces closed in from 3 sides like the jaws of a steel trap. "Phoenix, this is Groundhog 6, came the crackling voice of Sergeant First Class Marcus Thompson through her comm system, his usual steady tone now edged with desperation. "We've got approximately 40 hostiles moving and fast. GPS coordinates locked. We need immediate air support now." Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Maya's gloved fingers tightened around the flight controls as she banked hard left, the G-forces pressing against her chest like an invisible weight. Below, the sun baked. Mountains of Afghanistan stretched endlessly, their jagged peaks casting long shadows across valleys where American soldiers fought for their lives in a war that seemed to have no beginning and no end. She had been flying these skies for 3 years now, ever since graduating top of her class from the Air Force Academy. But today felt different. Today, something in the wind carried the scent of finality. "Roger that, Groundhog 6, Maya replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Phoenix inbound, ETA 90 seconds. Keep your heads down." Through her canopy, she could see the smoke rising from the valley thick, black columns that twisted upward like prayers toward heaven. The Rangers had been on a routine patrol when they'd stumbled into what intelligence now confirmed was a major insurgent stronghold, complete with heavy weapons, mortar, and enough ammunition to level a small city. What should have been a simple reconnaissance mission had turned into a nightmare of bullets and blood. Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez crouched behind her barrier, checking her rifle's magazine with practiced efficiency. 27 years old. Mother of twin boys back in San Antonio, she had joined the Army to pay for medical school, but had found something else entirely in the brotherhood of soldiers. Her dark eyes scanned the horizon, calculating angles and distances with the precision of someone who had learned that mathematics could mean the difference between going home and going to Arlington. "Thompson," she called to her squad leader, her voice cutting through the sharp crack of incoming fire. "We've got movement on the eastern ridge. Looks like they're setting up mortar." Marcus Thompson, 34 and a veteran of 4 deployments, felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. He had led men through the streets of Baghdad, through the mountains of Afghanistan, through hell itself, but he had never lost a soldier under his command. Today, that record hung by the thinnest of threads. "Copy that, Vasquez," he replied, adjusting his position behind the concrete barrier that had once been part of a school, a reminder that even in war zones, children had once laughed and learned in this very spot. "Phoenix, we need you to hit that eastern ridge first. They're about to rain hell down us." Maya's heart pounded as she dove lower, her aircraft cutting through the thin mountain air like a blade through silk. She had been born for this moment, though she never could have imagined it as a little girl growing up in East Los Angeles, where the sound of helicopters meant police chases rather than rescue missions. Her father, a mechanic at Lax, had taken her to air shows every summer, pointing up at the jets screaming overhead and telling her that the sky belonged to those brave enough to claim it. "Mija," he would say in his heavily accented English, "you got wings in your heart. Don't let nobody tell you they ain't strong enough to carry you." Now as she approached the target zone, Maya could feel those wings beating against her ribcage. The F-22's sophisticated targeting system painted the enemy positions in stark, digital clarity red dots representing human beings who had chosen to stand between her Rangers and safety. She had made this calculation hundreds of times in training, thousands of times in simulation, but the weight of it never diminished. Each red dot was someone's son, Someone's brother, someone's choice to fight. The radio crackled again, this time with a new voice, younger, shakier. "This is Private Collins," came the transmission, barely audible over the sound of gunfire. "We're almost out of ammo over here. Whatever you're gonna do, ma'am, please do it fast." Private Jamie Collins, 19 years old and fresh out of basic training, pressed his back against the concrete wall that separated him from death. His hands shook as he counted his remaining rounds, 7 bullets between him and surrender. He thought of his girlfriend Sarah back in Michigan, of the promise ring he had given her before deployment, of the letter he had written but never sent, explaining how much she meant to him. Maya's targeting computer locked onto the mortar position on the eastern ridge. Through her multi-function displays, she could see the enemy soldiers moving with military precision, setting up their weapons with the kind of efficiency that spoke of training and experience. These weren't random insurgents, they were professionals. And they knew exactly what they were doing. Groundhog 6 Phoenix, I have visual on the eastern ridge. Preparing to engage. Danger close, keep your people down. The words danger close sent a chill through every ranger in that valley. It meant the incoming ordnance would be close enough to their position that the difference between salvation and obliteration was measured in meters, not miles. It required absolute trust in the pilot's skill, trust in the technology, trust in the mathematics of destruction that governed modern warfare. Maya's finger hovered over the weapon release switch, a small toggle that would unleash 20mm cannon fire capable of turning human beings into memory in the span of a heartbeat. She thought of her flight training instructor, Colonel Patricia Hayes, the first woman to command a fighter squadron in the Air Force, who had told her class that being a pilot meant being the guardian angel that nobody ever saw coming. "You're not just flying a machine," Colonel Hayes had said during one late-night briefing session that had stretched past midnight. "You're carrying the hopes and fears of every soldier on the ground who believes that when they call for help, someone will answer. That's not just a job, that's a sacred trust." The valley below seemed to hold its breath as Maya made her final approach. The Rangers could hear the distinctive whistle of the F-22's engines, a sound that had become synonymous with salvation for American forces around the world. But for the enemy fighters positioning their mortar on the ridge, it was the sound of judgment approaching at Mach 2. Sergeant Vasquez used the momentary lull in enemy fire to check on her squad. To her left, Corporal David Kim was applying pressure to a shrapnel wound on his arm, his face pale but determined. The 23-year-old computer programmer turned soldier had surprised everyone, including himself, with his adaptability to combat. To her right, Specialist Maria Santos was methodically cleaning her rifle's action, her movements calm and deliberate despite the chaos around them. "How we looking, Santos?" Vasquez asked, noting the young woman's steady hands. "Good to go, Sergeant," Santos replied, her voice carrying the slight accent of her native Puerto Rico. "Just like my grandmother always said, keep your tools clean and your prayers cleaner." The sound of Maya's F-22 grew louder, a mechanical roar that seemed to shake the very mountains. But as she prepared to engage, her radar screen suddenly lit up with new contacts, fast-moving aircraft approaching from the north. Enemy fighters, at least 4 of them, closing in on her position with hostile intent. "Phoenix, this is Overwatch," came a new voice from the AWACS aircraft circling high above the battlefield. "We're showing 4 enemy fighters inbound to your position, bearing 030, altitude unknown. They're jamming our radar." Maya's blood turned to ice water in her veins. She was alone, outnumbered 4-1, with a dozen Rangers depending on her to clear the ridge before enemy mortar turned their defensive position into a crater. The tactical situation had just transformed from difficult to nearly impossible. "Groundhog 6 Phoenix," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. "We've got company coming in fast. I need to deal with these fighters before I can help you. Hold your position." "Negative, Phoenix." Thompson's voice came back immediately, tight with urgency. "We can't hold much longer. Those mortar are almost ready to fire. We need you now." Maya looked down at her fuel gauge, her ammunition counter, her tactical display showing the approaching enemy fighters. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and simple. She had enough fuel and weapons to either engage the enemy fighters or support the Rangers, but not both. Whatever choice she made in the next 30 seconds would determine who lived and who died in this forgotten corner of Afghanistan. The wind whistled through the valley below, carrying with it the scent of cordite and fear, of courage and desperation mixed together in the crucible of combat. Somewhere in that mix of dust and determination, 12 American soldiers waited for their angel to choose between her own survival and theirs. Maya Phoenix Rodriguez had never intended to become a fighter pilot. Growing up in Boyle Heights, the daughter of a single father who worked 18-hour days to keep food on the table, she had dreamed of becoming a teacher, maybe working with kids who looked like her and understood what it meant to fight for every opportunity. But dreams, she had learned, were fragile things that could be reshaped by a single moment of inspiration. She was 16 when she first saw the Thunderbirds perform at the Los Angeles County Air Show. Her father, exhausted after a double shift at the airport, had promised to take her as a reward for maintaining straight A's through her junior year. They sat on a hill overlooking the runway, sharing a bag of sunflower seeds, and watching as the blue and white jets danced through the sky with a precision that seemed to defy the laws of physics. "Myra Mia," her father had whispered, pointing. As the lead aircraft pulled into a vertical climb that seemed impossible, "That's not just flying. That's freedom." The memory flooded back now as Maya banked hard right, her F-22 responding to her touch like an extension of her own body. Below her, the Rangers were running out of time, and above her, 4 enemy fighters were closing in with lethal intent. The choice before her was the kind that defined careers, lives, and legacies. Engage the fighters and possibly survive to fight another day, or dive into the valley and save the Rangers while likely sacrificing herself in the process. Her hands moved across the cockpit controls with muscle memory, born of thousands of hours of training. Every switch, every button, every display had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. But no amount of training could prepare a pilot for the weight of impossible choices. "Phoenix, this is Colonel Mitchell at talk," came a voice from the Tactical Operations Center, hundreds of miles away, but connected to her by satellite link. "We're tracking your situation. You are ordered to engage the enemy fighters first. Protect yourself and your aircraft." The order was clear, logical, and tactically sound. The F-22 was worth more than $2 billion and represented years of advanced research and development. From a strategic standpoint, preserving the aircraft and its pilot for future missions made perfect sense. But Maya could hear the sound of automatic weapons fire crackling through her comm system, could see the muzzle flashes lighting up the valley floor like deadly fireflies. "Roger, talk," she replied. But her heart was already making a different calculation. In the valley below, Sergeant Thompson was making calculations of his own. He had been in combat long enough to recognize the sound of approaching doom, and the whistle of incoming mortar shells was a symphony he knew by heart. The enemy fighters on the ridge had finished setting up their weapons and were beginning to adjust their aim based on the Rangers' defensive positions. "Vasquez," he called to his squad leader, "get everyone ready to move. We're gonna have to make a run for it." Elena Vasquez looked across the open ground that separated their position from the next available cover, nearly 200 meters of exposed terrain that would become a killing field the moment they left their concrete barriers. She had run similar distances in training, but never while carrying full combat equipment and never with people shooting at her. "Where to, Sergeant?" she asked, though they both knew the answer. There was nowhere to run. The enemy had positioned themselves on 3 sides, creating a funnel that would channel the Rangers directly into their crossfire. It was a textbook ambush, executed with the kind of precision that spoke of extensive planning and reconnaissance. Private Collins checked his rifle one more time, counting his remaining ammunition with the obsessive attention to detail of a man who understood that each bullet might be his last. 7 rounds. He had trained with these weapons for months, had fired thousands of rounds on ranges from Georgia to California, but 7 bullets felt like nothing when facing an entire enemy force. "Hey, Collins," Specialist Santos called softly from her position. Nearby. "You okay over there?" Jamie Collins looked at the young woman who had become like a sister to him during their deployment. Maria Santos was only 2 years older than him, but she carried herself with the confidence of someone who had found her place in the world. She had joined the army to escape the poverty of her childhood in San Juan, but had discovered a talent for leadership that surprised even her. "Yeah," he lied, his voice barely audible over the sound of gunfire. "Just thinking about home." Santos nodded, understanding the weight of that simple statement. Home was a place that existed in photographs and letters, in memories that seemed both crystal clear and impossibly distant. For soldiers in combat, home became both motivation and torment, the thing worth fighting for and the thing that made dying seem unbearable. High above the valley, Maya made her decision with the sudden clarity that sometimes comes in moments of absolute crisis. The enemy fighters were still 90 seconds out, approaching fast but not yet in weapons range. She had 90 seconds to make a difference for the Rangers below, 90 seconds to justify every hour of training, every sacrifice her father had made, every dream she had carried with her from the streets of East LA to the cockpit of the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. She rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, her F-22 accelerating toward the valley floor at a rate that would have been fatal in a less advanced aircraft. The D-forces pressed against her body like a crushing weight, but she had trained for this, had pushed her physical limits in centrifuges and pressure chambers, until her body learned to function even when blood flow was restricted and vision began to narrow. "Phoenix, what are you doing?" came Colonel Mitchell's voice, sharp with concern. "You are ordered to engage the fighters first." "Negative talk," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the tremendous forces acting on her body. "Groundhog 6. Needs immediate assistance. I'm going in." The decision violated direct orders, violated tactical doctrine, violated every principle of self-preservation that had been drilled into her during flight training. But as she dove toward the valley floor, Maya felt something she had never experienced before: a perfect alignment between her heart and her mission, between who she was and who she was meant to be. The Rangers heard the sound of her engines, changing pitch as she dove, the mechanical roar growing louder and more urgent. They had worked with close air support before, had called in strikes from A-10s and F-16s, but the F-22 was different. It was faster, more precise, more deadly, and in the hands of a pilot willing to risk everything, it could work miracles. "Phoenix is inbound," Thompson shouted to his squad, his voice carrying a note of hope that had been absent for the past 20 minutes. "Keep your heads down and get ready to move when she clears the ridge." Maya's targeting computer locked onto the mortar position on the eastern ridge, painting the enemy fighters in stark digital clarity. She could see them moving with practiced efficiency, adjusting their weapons for maximum effect against the Rangers' position. In 15 seconds, those mortar would begin firing, and the concrete barriers that were currently keeping the Americans alive would become inadequate protection. Against high explosive shells, her finger moved to the weapon select switch, cycling through her available options. The F-22's 20mm cannon carried 480 rounds of ammunition, each round capable of devastating accuracy at ranges that would have been impossible for earlier generations of aircraft. She had practiced this shot thousands of times in simulation, but simulation couldn't account for the weight of real lives hanging in the balance. Groundhog 6, Phoenix. Guns hot, engaging Eastern Ridge. Danger close. The words danger close carried special meaning in military parlance. They indicated that friendly forces were within the minimum safe distance from the target, that the margin for error had been reduced to almost nothing. It required absolute trust between pilot and ground forces, trust that had been built through years of training and forged in the crucible of combat. Maya's aircraft screamed over the valley floor at an altitude that would have been suicidal in most combat situations. But the F-22's advanced stealth technology made her nearly invisible to enemy radar systems. She was a ghost in the machine, death approaching at supersonic speed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. The first burst from her cannon lit up the eastern ridge like a string of fireworks, 20mm shells impacting with devastating accuracy. The enemy mortar position disappeared in a cloud of smoke and debris, along with the soldiers who had been preparing to rain death down on the Rangers below. Direct hit. Cain Vasquez's voice over the COM system, filled with relief and admiration. "Phoenix, you just saved our asses." But Maya wasn't finished. Her tactical display showed enemy positions on 2 other ridges, machine gun nests and sniper positions that had been systematically eliminating the Rangers' options for movement. She pulled up hard, her aircraft climbing toward the second target in a maneuver that pushed both machine and pilot to their absolute limits. The enemy fighters were closing in now, their radar signatures becoming clearer on her threat display. She had perhaps 30 seconds before they would be in weapons range. 30 seconds to complete her strafing run before she would be forced to defend herself against superior numbers. As Maya lined up for her second attack run, her mind drifted to the conversation she had shared with Colonel Patricia Hayes just before deployment. They had been sitting in Hayes's office at Nellis Air Force Base, watching the sun set over the Nevada desert through windows that offered a view of the flight line, where F-22 sat in perfect rows like sleeping predators. "Rodriguez, Colonel," Hayes had said, her voice carrying the weight of experience earned over 20 years of military service. "I'm going to tell you something that they don't teach in flight school. There will come a moment in your career when you have to choose between following orders and following your conscience. When that moment comes, you'll know it in your bones. And whatever choice you make, you'll have to live with it for the rest of your life." Maya had nodded, thinking she understood, but understanding and experiencing were 2 entirely different things. Now diving toward her second target with enemy fighters closing in from behind, she felt the full weight of Colonel Hayes's words. She was betting everything, her career, her life, her future on 90 seconds of precision flying, and the hope that she could save 12 Rangers before the enemy could stop her. The second burst of cannon fire was even more accurate than the first, her shells walking across the western ridge with mechanical precision. Enemy soldiers scattered like leaves in a windstorm, their carefully planned ambush dissolving into chaos as their heavy weapons were systematically destroyed. "Phoenix, you magnificent crazy woman," came Corporal Kim's voice, filled with the kind of joy that only comes from unexpected salvation. "I don't know how you're doing this, but keep it up." David Kim had been certain he was going to die in this valley. The computer programmer turned soldier had joined the Army Reserve to pay for college, never imagining that he would find himself in a firefight in Afghanistan, bleeding from shrapnel wounds while enemy fighters closed in from 3 sides. But as he watched Maya's F-22 dancing through the sky above him, he felt something he had never experienced in combat hope. Maya's threat display was screaming warnings now as the enemy fighters closed to within weapon range. She could see them. On her rear-facing camera, 4 sleek aircraft moving in perfect formation with the predatory grace of aerial hunters. They were good, probably trained by the same instructors who had taught her the fundamentals of air-to-air combat. "Phoenix, brake right now," came the urgent voice of the AWACS controller. "You've got multiple missiles inbound." Maya yanked her aircraft into a violent right turn, pulling gale forces that would have incapacitated an untrained pilot. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel as blood flow was restricted to her brain, but she had learned to function in this state, had trained her body to operate even when her circulatory system was fighting against the forces of physics. Behind her, air-to-air missiles streaked through the space she had occupied just seconds earlier, their proximity fuses failing to detect a target close enough to detonate. But more missiles were already in the air, and the enemy fighters were closing in for guns range, where her stealth technology would be less effective. She had one more target to eliminate, a machine gun nest on the northern ridge that had been systematically picking off Rangers whenever they tried to change position. But engaging that target would require another low-altitude pass, another moment of vulnerability while enemy fighters maneuvered for advantage in the sky above. The choice was becoming clearer by the second: complete her mission and almost certainly die in the process, or break off the attack and try to survive the air-to-air engagement that was developing overhead. Either choice would have consequences that extended far beyond her personal survival. In the valley below, Thompson was coordinating his squad's movement toward better cover, using the chaos created by Maya's attacks to reposition his soldiers for a possible breakout. But he knew that without eliminating that final machine gun nest, any movement across open ground would result in casualties his unit couldn't afford. "Phoenix," he transmitted, his voice calm despite the desperate circumstances. "We need that. Northern ridge cleared before we can move. But don't sacrifice yourself for us. We'll find another way if we have to." The words carried the weight of command responsibility that Thompson had carried for over a decade. He had learned to make impossible choices, to balance the lives of his soldiers against tactical objectives, to carry the burden of decisions. That would haunt him long after the shooting stopped. Maya heard the sergeant's transmission as she maneuvered through a complex series of defensive turns, trying to shake the enemy fighters that were closing in from multiple directions. Her aircraft was performing flawlessly, responding to her inputs with the precision that made the F-22 the most capable air superiority fighter ever built. But she was still outnumbered 4-1, and the enemy pilots were demonstrating skill, levels that suggested extensive training and combat experience. "Negative, Groundhog 6, she replied, rolling inverted and diving toward the valley floor once again. "I didn't come this far to leave the job half done." The decision crystallized in her mind with perfect clarity. She would complete her mission, eliminate the final threat to the Rangers, and then engage the enemy fighters with whatever fuel and ammunition she had remaining. It wasn't about following orders or tactical doctrine. It was about the sacred trust between pilots and ground forces, the unspoken promise that when soldiers called for help, someone would answer. Her cannon blazed for the third time, the stream of 20mm shells reaching out across the distance between her aircraft and the machine gun nest like fingers of controlled destruction. The target disappeared in smoke and flame, eliminating the final obstacle to the Rangers' escape from their deadly predicament. All targets neutralized. Maya transmitted, pulling up hard as missile warning tones filled her cockpit. "Groundhog 6, you are clear to move." But even as she spoke the words, she knew that her own situation had become untenable. The enemy fighters had used her low-altitude attack run to position themselves for a coordinated assault, and her aircraft's defensive systems were detecting multiple radar locks from different directions. The sky above the Afghan valley transformed into a three-dimensional chess game played at supersonic speeds, where the penalty for making the wrong move was measured not in captured pieces but in human lives. Maya pulled her F-22 into a climbing spiral, using every ounce of the aircraft's exceptional power to weight ratio to gain altitude and maneuvering room, while enemy missiles streaked through the air around her like deadly meteors. "Phoenix, this is Razor 1, came a new voice through her comm system, crisp and professional with a slight southern drawl. "We're inbound to your position with 4 F-16s. ETA 3 minutes. Can you hold out that long?" Major Jake Razor Morrison had been leading the 421st Fighter Squadron for 18 months, but he had never heard a combat situation develop as rapidly as the one unfolding in the mountains ahead of him. Intelligence reports had indicated light enemy activity in the region, nothing that would require more than a single aircraft for close air support. The appearance of enemy fighters had caught everyone off guard, transforming a routine support mission into a full-scale air battle. "Roger, Razor 1, Maya replied, her voice strained as she pulled nearly 9 Gs in a defensive turn that would have crushed an unprotected human body. "I'll be here when you arrive, assuming these guys don't get lucky." The lead enemy fighter, designated Bandit 1 on her threat display, was closing in from her 11 o'clock position with the patience of an experienced hunter. Maya could see the aircraft clearly now, a Soviet-era design that had been extensively modified with modern avionics and weapon systems. The pilot flying it clearly understood both his aircraft's capabilities and hers, maneuvering with a precision that suggested hundreds of hours of combat experience. Below in the valley, Sergeant Thompson was coordinating the most dangerous part of any combat operation movement under fire. The Rangers needed to cross nearly 300 meters of open ground to reach a defensive position that would offer better protection and multiple escape routes. It was the kind of tactical movement that looked simple on paper but could turn deadly in seconds if not executed with perfect timing and coordination. "Vasquez, take point with Santos and Kim," Thompson ordered, his voice carrying clearly over the squad radio network. "Collins, Miller, and Jackson will provide covering fire from here until you reach the rocks. Then we'll leapfrog to your position." Elena Vasquez felt the familiar pre-combat calm settling over her as she prepared to lead her soldiers across what military tacticians euphemistically called the X, that moment of maximum exposure when survival depended entirely on speed, luck, and the enemy's marksmanship skills. She had made similar movements in Iraq, in other parts of Afghanistan, in training exercises that had prepared her for everything except the reality of watching tracer rounds streak past her head, velocities that turned mistakes into obituaries. "Santos, Kim, you ready?" she asked, checking her weapon one final time. "Ready, Sergeant," came Santos's reply. Steady and confident despite the circumstances, Corporal Kim nodded, his wounded arm bound with field dressings that had turned dark with dried blood. The computer programmer had discovered reserves of courage he never knew he possessed, had found that when survival was at stake, the human body could function despite pain, despite fear, despite the mathematical certainty that some percentage of soldiers making this kind of movement would not reach the other side alive. "On my mark," Vasquez said, gathering herself for the sprint that would either save them or kill them. 3.2.1. Move. The 3 soldiers erupted from their defensive position like sprinters leaving the starting blocks, their boots pounding against the rocky ground as they raced toward the cover of the boulder field 200 meters away. Behind them, their squad mates opened fire with everything they had, sending streams of automatic weapons fire toward any enemy position that might threaten the movement. High above the valley, Maya was fighting her own battle for survival against odds that would have challenged even the most experienced combat pilot. The enemy fighters had spread out into a combat formation that maximized their numerical advantage while minimizing their exposure to her superior technology. It was textbook air-to-air tactics, executed with a level of coordination that spoke of extensive training and real-world experience. "Phoenix, Bandit 1 is maneuvering for a gun solution," warned the AWACS controller, his voice tense with the awareness that he was watching a drama unfold that could end in catastrophe. "Recommend defensive spiral, descending. Maya rolled, inverted and pulled down toward the valley floor, using the mountainous terrain to break the enemy pilot's radar lock while simultaneously setting up for a potential counterattack. The F-22's advanced flight control system made maneuvers possible that would have been suicidal in earlier generations of fighter aircraft. But even the most sophisticated technology couldn't overcome the basic mathematics of being outnumbered. 4-1, Bandit 1 followed her down in a diving turn that demonstrated exceptional flying skills, matching her maneuver for maneuver while maintaining the offensive advantage. Maya could see the enemy aircraft in her mirrors, close enough now that she could make out details of its configuration and weaponry. It was flown by someone who understood the deadly dance of air combat, who knew when to press an advantage and when to be patient. "Come on," she whispered to herself, pulling her aircraft through a series of barrel rolls that would have made aerobatic spectators gasp in amazement. "Let's see what you've got." The enemy pilot proved to have quite a lot. Bandit 1 stayed with her through every maneuver, gradually closing the distance while his wingman moved to cut off her escape routes. It was classic pack hunting behavior, with one fighter maintaining pressure while the others maneuvered for killing positions out in the valley below. Vasquez, Santos, and Kim reached the relative safety of the boulder field after a sprint that seemed to last forever but had actually taken less than 30 seconds. All three soldiers collapsed behind the rocks, breathing heavily from exertion and adrenaline while scanning their new surroundings for threats. "Thompson, we're in position," Vasquez reported, her voice slightly breathless but steady. "Good fields of fire from here. Send the next group when ready." But as Thompson prepared to send Collins, Miller, and Jackson across the same killing ground, a new threat emerged from the eastern ridge. Enemy reinforcements had arrived, at least 20 additional fighters moving down from the mountains with the kind of equipment and coordination that suggested this hadn't been a chance encounter, but a carefully planned ambush. "Shit," Thompson muttered, watching through his binoculars as the new enemy force spread out into assault positions. "Vasquez, we've got company coming your way. Looks like they're gonna try to overrun your position before we can consolidate." The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. The Rangers were now split between two positions with insufficient ammunition and enemy forces closing in from multiple directions. Above them, Maya was fighting for her life against superior numbers, and the promised reinforcements were still minutes away. Private Collins felt his heart rate spike as he watched the enemy reinforcements moving down the mountainside with military precision. These weren't random insurgents. They moved with the coordination of well-trained soldiers, using proper cover and concealment techniques while maintaining formation integrity. Someone had planned this ambush very carefully. "Sergeant," he called to Thompson, his young voice carrying a note of fear that he couldn't quite suppress. "What do we do if they overrun Vasquez's position?" Thompson looked at the 19-year-old soldier, who had been thrust into a situation that would have challenged veterans with years of combat experience. Collins was scared. Any sane person would be scared, but he was still functioning, still asking the right questions, still ready to do his job despite the overwhelming circumstances. "We adapt and overcome, Collins," Thompson replied, using the phrase that had become a mantra for soldiers facing impossible odds. That's what Rangers do. But privately, Thompson was running out of options. His squad was outnumbered at least 3-1, was running low on ammunition, and had been split by enemy action into two defensive positions that couldn't effectively support each other. The only thing keeping them alive was Maya's continued presence overhead, and she was fighting her own desperate battle against enemy aircraft. Maya's situation was becoming increasingly untenable with each passing second. Bandit 1 had maneuvered into a position where he could bring his guns to bear, while Bandits 2 and 3 were setting up for coordinated missile attacks that would be almost impossible to evade. Her fuel gauge was dropping toward critical levels, and her ammunition counter showed that she had expended nearly half her cannon rounds during the strafing attacks on the ridges. "Phoenix, this is Razor 1, came Major Morrison's voice, urgent. "Now with proximity. We're 2 minutes out. Can you break contact and climb to altitude?" Breaking contact would mean abandoning the Rangers to face the new enemy assault without air support. Maya looked down at the valley where she could see muzzle flashes beginning to flicker as the fresh enemy forces engaged Vasquez's position. The 3 Rangers behind the boulder field were about to be overrun by superior numbers, and the rest of Thompson's squad was too far away to provide effective support. "Negative, Razor 1, she replied, rolling left to avoid a stream of cannon. "Fire from Bandit 1. I've got Rangers in contact down here. They need immediate support." The decision went against every principle of tactical aviation, every doctrine about preserving expensive aircraft and highly trained pilots. But as Maya dove toward the valley floor once again, she felt the same certainty that had guided her through the earlier attacks. Some things were more important than doctrine. Her cannon blazed once more, this time targeting the enemy assault force that was advancing on Vasquez's position. The 20mm shells impacted with devastating effect, turning the organized advance into confusion as enemy soldiers scattered for cover. But the attack run left her vulnerable to Bandit 1, who had been waiting for exactly this opportunity. "Phoenix, break right," came the AWACS controller's urgent warning. "Missiles in the air." Maya yanked her aircraft into a violent defensive maneuver, but she was too low, too slow, and too committed to her attack run. The enemy pilot had timed his attack perfectly, launching a heat-seeking missile at the moment, when her aircraft's defensive options were most limited. The missile impacted her left engine with the kind of precision that spoke of advanced guidance technology and expert timing. Warning lights flooded her cockpit as hydraulic systems failed and flight controls became sluggish. The F-22's sophisticated damage control systems isolated the damaged engine and automatically adjusted the flight control surfaces to compensate. But the aircraft had been transformed from a supersonic predator into a wounded bird fighting to stay airborne. "Phoenix is hit," Maya transmitted, her voice tight with concentration as she fought to maintain control. "I've lost my left engine, and I'm showing multiple system failures. But I'm still flying." The words carried more meaning than their simple declaration might suggest. In the language of combat aviation, still flying meant that despite catastrophic damage, despite system failures that would have grounded the aircraft under normal circumstances, the pilot was maintaining control and remaining in the fight. It was a declaration of intent as much as a status report. Below in the valley, the Rangers had heard the explosion as the missile found its target, had seen the trail of smoke beginning to stream from Maya's damaged aircraft. But they had also seen the devastating effect of her final strafing run, which had broken up the enemy assault and bought them precious time to consolidate their positions. "Phoenix, what's your status?" Thompson asked, his voice carrying the concern of a ground commander who understood that his soldiers' survival depended on the wounded aircraft circling overhead. "I've got one good engine and maybe 10 minutes of fuel," Maya replied, checking her instruments with the methodical precision of a pilot trained to function even when her aircraft was dying around her. "But I'm not going anywhere until you people are safe." The statement was both a promise and a death sentence. With her fuel running critically low and enemy fighters still maneuvering for killing positions, Maya had perhaps one more attack run before her aircraft would be forced to attempt an emergency landing in hostile territory. But she could see the tactical situation developing below, enemy reinforcements continuing to pour down from the mountains, the Rangers' defensive positions becoming increasingly untenable, the careful choreography of modern warfare tilting inexorably toward disaster. Specialist Santos had found a defensive position among the boulders that offered excellent fields of fire toward the enemy advance. The young woman from Puerto Rico had discovered that her childhood spent hunting in the mountains had translated surprisingly well to military marksmanship, and she was methodically engaging targets with the patience of someone who understood that ammunition was finite and every shot had to count. "Kim, can you see that group moving along the ridgeline?" she asked, pointing toward a squad of enemy fighters who were trying to flank their position from the north. Corporal Kim adjusted his position despite the pain from his wounded arm, bringing his rifle to bear on the targets Santos had identified. The computer programmer had learned to compartmentalize pain during combat, had discovered that the human mind could ignore physical discomfort when survival was at stake. "I see them," he replied, settling into a stable firing position. "Range: about 200 meters. Wind's minimal. I've got the one on the left." "Take him on my mark," Santos said, lining up her own shot on the lead enemy fighter. 3.2. One fire. Both rifles fired simultaneously, their synchronized shots reaching across the distance to find their targets with lethal precision. 2 enemy soldiers dropped, while the rest of their squad scrambled for cover among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the mountainside. But for every enemy fighter they eliminated, 2 more seemed to take his place. The ambush had been planned, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested intelligence gathering, reconnaissance, and careful preparation. Someone had known that American forces would be operating in this valley, had positioned fighters with heavy weapons and prepared escape routes, had turned a routine patrol into a carefully orchestrated trap. High above the battle, Maya was making calculations that would have challenged a computer. Her remaining fuel gave her perhaps 8 minutes of flight time, maybe 10 if she pushed the aircraft to its absolute limits. Her damaged engine was running rough, producing power inconsistently while warning lights continued to flash across. Her instrument panel like a Christmas tree designed by someone with a morbid sense of humor. The enemy fighters were closing in. Again, having regrouped after her defensive maneuvering and prepared for another coordinated attack. Bandit 1 was particularly persistent, matching her every move with the patience of someone who understood that time was on his side. All he had to do was wait for her fuel to run out, then finish off both the crippled F-22 and the Rangers trapped in the valley below. "Razor 1, Phoenix," Maya transmitted, her voice steady despite the desperate circumstances. "How far out are you now?" 90 seconds, Phoenix," came Major Morrison's reply, tinged with the frustration of a commander who could see the battle developing but couldn't yet influence its outcome. "We're coming in fast and heavy. Just hold on a little longer." 90 seconds might as well have been 90 minutes, given Maya's fuel situation and the tactical picture developing below. The enemy reinforcements had reorganized after her strafing attack and were preparing for a final assault on the Rangers' positions. She could see them moving with military precision, using proper cover and advanced techniques while coordinating their assault through what appeared to be sophisticated communication equipment. Thompson was conducting his own desperate calculations from his position behind the concrete barriers. His squad had expended nearly 70% of their ammunition during the sustained firefight, and the enemy forces arrayed against them had grown to at least 50 fighters with crew-served weapons and what appeared to be portable mortar. The mathematics of small unit tactics were brutally simple. Without immediate resupply or reinforcement, his Rangers would be overrun within minutes. "Collins, Miller, Jackson," he called to the 3 soldiers still sharing his defensive position. "We're gonna have to make a run for Vasquez's location. It's the only way we can consolidate our defense." Private Collins felt his stomach drop as he looked across the open ground that separated their position from the boulder field where the rest of their squad had taken cover. The distance was manageable, maybe 150 meters, but it would require crossing terrain that was completely exposed to enemy observation and fire. "Sergeant," Collins said, his voice barely audible over the sound of incoming rounds impacting their concrete barriers. What about Phoenix? She's running out of fuel. Thompson looked up at the smoke trail, marking Maya's damaged aircraft as she continued to circle overhead despite her critical situation. The young pilot had already risked everything to keep his Rangers alive, had violated direct orders, and engaged superior numbers to break up the ambush that should have killed them all. Now she was flying a crippled aircraft on borrowed time, refusing to abandon them even when her own survival depended on immediate withdrawal from the combat zone. "Phoenix has done enough," Thompson replied, but even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Maya's presence overhead was the only thing preventing the enemy forces from massing for a coordinated assault that would overwhelm the Rangers' defensive positions. Without her continued support, their planned movement to consolidate positions would become a suicide run across open ground. Maya had reached the same conclusion from her aerial vantage point. She could see the enemy forces positioning themselves for a final assault, could observe their tactical movements and coordination with the clarity that came from training and experience. The Rangers below were brave, professional, and determined, but they were also outnumbered 5-1 by fighters who clearly understood infantry tactics and possessed the weapons necessary to execute a successful assault. Her fuel gauge showed 3 minutes of flight time remaining, maybe 4 if she throttled back to minimum power settings. Her damaged engine was running increasingly rough, producing occasional flameouts that required restart procedures while enemy fighters maneuvered for killing positions around her. The smart move, the tactically sound move, would be to climb to altitude and attempt to reach friendly territory before her fuel ran out completely. Instead, she rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor once more, her remaining cannon rounds glowing on her weapons display like precious gems in an inventory that was rapidly approaching zero. She had perhaps 50 rounds remaining, maybe 60 enough for one final strafing run before her ammunition was exhausted and her aircraft became nothing more than an expensive glider with a smoke trail. "Phoenix, what are you doing?" came Colonel Mitchell's voice from the talk, sharp with concern and disbelief. "You are critically low on fuel and ammunition. Withdraw immediately and attempt to reach friendly territory." The order was clear, direct, and completely logical from a strategic standpoint. Maya was about to throw away a $2 billion aircraft and the life of a highly trained pilot for a squad of soldiers who were probably going to be overrun regardless of her actions. From the perspective of resource management and strategic planning, her continued presence over the battlefield served no useful purpose. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying this story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Negative talk," Maya replied, lining up for what she knew would be her final attack run. "I have Rangers in contact and ammunition remaining. Mission continues." The words carried the weight of a decision that would define her legacy, would determine how she was remembered long after the smoke cleared and the official reports were filed. She was choosing to spend the last of her resources, the final minutes of her aircraft's operational capability, on soldiers she had never met, but had sworn to protect. Below her, Thompson's Rangers were preparing to make their desperate sprint across open ground when Maya's final strafing run lit up the mountainside like the 4th of July. Her remaining cannon rounds walked across the enemy assault positions with mechanical precision, disrupting their coordination and buying the Rangers precious seconds to begin their movement. "Move, move, move," Thompson shouted, and Collins, Miller, and Jackson erupted from their defensive position. Like runners leaving the starting blocks, the 3 soldiers raced across the open ground, while Maya's aircraft pulled up from her final attack run, her engines coughing and sputtering as fuel starvation began to affect their operation. She had given the Rangers their chance, now it was up to their training, their courage, and their luck to carry them across the killing ground to safety. But Bandit 1 had been waiting for exactly this moment. When Maya's aircraft was most vulnerable, and her options most limited. The enemy pilot launched his final missile with the timing of someone who understood aerial combat, who had been patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to eliminate both the crippled F-22 and its stubborn pilot. Maya saw the missile launch on her threat display and knew immediately that she didn't have enough airspeed or maneuvering energy to evade it. Her damaged aircraft was operating at the edge of its flight envelope, barely maintaining controlled flight, while her fuel gauge showed empty across all tanks. She had perhaps 30 seconds of flight time remaining, and the missile closing in from behind would reach her in 15. "Razor 1, Phoenix," she transmitted, her voice calm despite the mathematical certainty of her situation. "I'm about to go down. The Rangers are making their move now. Cover them when you arrive." Major Morrison heard the transmission as his flight of F-16s finally crested the mountain range and dove toward the battle, their afterburners painting brilliant orange trails across the afternoon sky. He could see Maya's damaged F-22 streaming smoke as it struggled to maintain altitude, could see the missile tracking toward her with inexorable precision, could see the Rangers sprinting across open ground in the valley below. "Phoenix, eject!" he commanded, knowing even as he spoke that ejection at her current altitude and airspeed would be survivable only under ideal circumstances. "Get out of there now." But Maya had made a different calculation in the seconds before impact. Her aircraft was positioned directly over the largest concentration of enemy forces, and the F-22's internal fuel tanks still contained enough aviation fuel to create a significant explosion. If she could control her aircraft's impact point, could guide it into the enemy positions during its final moments, she might eliminate enough fighters to give the Rangers a realistic chance of survival. It was the kind of calculation that separated true warriors from people who simply wore uniforms, the difference between following orders and accepting responsibility for the consequences of every decision. Maya had joined the Air Force to serve her country, had trained for years to become the guardian angel that soldiers could call upon in their darkest moments. Now, in the final seconds of her combat career, she had the opportunity to fulfill that promise in the most absolute way possible. "Negative on the ejection, Razor 1, she replied, fighting to maintain control as her aircraft began its final descent toward the valley floor. "I'm going to give these Rangers a gift they'll never forget." The missile struck Maya's F-22 with the devastating precision of modern warfare, but instead of the catastrophic explosion that should have marked the end of both pilot and aircraft, something extraordinary happened. The projectile's warhead detonated against the Raptor's left wing, shearing off control surfaces and severing hydraulic lines. But the aircraft's revolutionary design and Maya's exceptional piloting skills combined to create what could only be described as a controlled crash rather than a fatal impact. Maya fought the damaged aircraft with every ounce of skill she possessed, using differential thrust from her remaining engine and manual flight control inputs to guide the F-22 toward the largest concentration of enemy forces. The aircraft responded sluggishly to her commands, its sophisticated fly-by-wire system struggling to compensate for massive structural damage and multiple system failures, but it responded nonetheless. "Phoenix is going down," came the urgent transmission from the AWACS controller, his voice tight with the knowledge that he was witnessing something unprecedented in modern aerial warfare. "I repeat, Phoenix is going down, but she appears to have some control." In the valley below, the Rangers were witnessing something that would be talked about in military circles for decades to come. Maya's crippled F-22, trailing smoke and flame, like a wounded dragon, was descending toward the mountainside in a controlled glide that defied both physics and logic. But more importantly, it was heading directly toward the enemy positions that had been preparing to overrun their defensive locations. "Jesus Christ," whispered Specialist Santos, pausing in her desperate sprint across open ground to watch the impossible scene unfolding overhead. "She's flying it right into them." The enemy fighters positioned along the ridgeline had perhaps 10 seconds to realize what was happening. 10 seconds to understand that $2 billion worth of American military technology was about to impact their positions with the force of a guided meteor. Some of them began to scatter, abandoning their weapons and equipment in a desperate attempt to escape the approaching destruction. Others, either paralyzed by the impossibility of what they were witnessing or committed to their positions by training or fanaticism, remained in place. Maya's aircraft impacted the eastern ridge with tremendous force, its remaining fuel igniting in a fireball that could be seen from miles away. The explosion eliminated the enemy's heavy weapons positions, scattered their assault formations, and created enough chaos and confusion to fundamentally alter the tactical balance in the valley below. But Maya herself had ejected at the last possible moment, her ejection seat carrying her clear of the impact zone with mere seconds to spare. The timing had been calculated with the precision that characterized everything about her approach to combat aviation late enough to ensure her aircraft reached its intended target, early enough to give her a realistic chance of survival. Major Morrison's flight of F-16s arrived over the valley just as Maya's parachute deployed, her bright orange canopy standing out against the smoke and flame rising from the mountainside like a flag of defiance. The timing couldn't have been more perfect if it had been choreographed by Hollywood directors, rather than determined by the brutal mathematics of aerial combat. "Razor flight, this is Razor 1, Morrison transmitted to his wingman, his voice filled with professional admiration for what he had just witnessed. "We've got a pilot in the silk and Rangers in contact. Let's finish what Phoenix started." The 4 F-16s dove toward the valley with the fury of avenging angels, their weapons systems locked onto the scattered enemy positions that had survived Maya's sacrifice. But the tactical situation had been fundamentally transformed by her actions. What had been a coordinated enemy assault involving dozens of fighters with heavy weapons had become a collection of small groups struggling to re-establish communication and coordination while dealing with casualties and equipment losses. Maya's parachute descent gave her a unique perspective on the battle that was still developing below. She could see the Rangers completing their movement between defensive positions, could observe the enemy forces attempting to regroup after the devastating impact of her aircraft, could watch as Morrison's F-16s began systematically eliminating the remaining threats with precision-guided weapons. But she could also see something that the other participants in the battle couldn't observe from their ground-level or high-altitude perspectives. The enemy ambush had been even more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Hidden positions along multiple ridgelines contained fighters who had remained concealed during the initial engagement, and equipment caches positioned throughout the valley suggested that this operation had been planned weeks or even months in advance. "Razor 1, Phoenix," she transmitted from her parachute, using the emergency radio that was standard equipment in ejection seat survival kits. "You've got additional enemy positions on the western ridgeline, approximately 2 clicks from the primary engagement area. They're moving to flank the Rangers' position." Morrison immediately adjusted his flight's attack pattern based on Maya's intelligence, directing 2 of his F-16s toward the newly identified threats while maintaining coverage over the Rangers' immediate area. The information provided by Maya's elevated perspective was proving as valuable as her earlier attacks in keeping Thompson's squad alive. Below on the valley floor, Sergeant Thompson was coordinating his squad's defensive preparations with the methodical precision of a professional soldier who understood that battles were won through attention to detail rather than individual heroics. The Rangers had successfully consolidated their positions in the boulder field, where they had better fields of fire and multiple escape routes if the tactical situation continued to deteriorate. "Vasquez, how are we looking on ammunition?" Thompson asked, conducting the kind of resource assessment that determined whether small units lived or died in extended engagements. "We're down to about 30% of basic load. Elena Vasquez replied, checking each soldier's remaining ammunition with the thoroughness that had kept her squad alive through multiple deployments. Santos has the most rounds remaining, Collins. Is down to his last magazine. Private Collins felt a moment of shame at being identified as the soldier with the least ammunition remaining, until he remembered that he had been engaging targets almost continuously for the past hour while his more experienced squad mates had been more selective in their target acquisition. Combat was a learning experience that could be both educational and fatal, and he was receiving an advanced course in resource management under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. It's okay, Collins, Santos said, reading the expression on the young soldier's face. You did good work out there. That's why we train to share ammunition when needed. The words carried more meaning than a simple tactical instruction. They represented the brotherhood that existed between soldiers in combat, the understanding that individual survival depended on collective success, the knowledge that every person in the squad was responsible for everyone else's welfare. Maya's parachute descent was carrying her toward a landing zone that appeared to be relatively clear of enemy forces, though the intelligence picture was changing rapidly as Morrison's F-16s continued their systematic elimination of hostile positions. Her emergency radio was crackling with situation reports from multiple aircraft, ground controllers, and the Rangers themselves, creating a complex tapestry of information that told the story of a battle that was finally tilting in favor of the American forces. "Phoenix, this is Groundhog 6, came Thompson's voice, filled with emotion that the professional soldier was struggling to keep under control. I don't have adequate words to express our gratitude for what you've done. You saved our lives." The simple statement carried the weight of military tradition that stretched back through centuries of warfare, the acknowledgement of sacrifice that passed between warriors who had shared the ultimate test of courage and commitment. Maya had risked everything, her aircraft, her career, her life for soldiers she had never met but had sworn to protect. It was the kind of action that defined military service at its highest level. "Just doing my job, Groundhog 6, Maya replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline and emotion coursing through her system. "Make sure you people get home safe. That's all the thanks I need." But even as she spoke, Maya knew that the battle was far from over. Her emergency descent was carrying her toward a landing zone that was nominally friendly but still within range of enemy forces that might have survived the coordinated air attacks. Her survival depended on reaching the ground safely and then evading capture until friendly forces could organize a rescue operation. The landscape rushing up to meet her was typical of Afghanistan's mountainous regions, rocky terrain interspersed with patches of scrub vegetation, offering both concealment opportunities and navigation challenges for someone attempting to evade enemy forces on foot. Maya had trained extensively for this kind of survival situation, but training and reality were two entirely different experiences. Her parachute landing was textbook perfect, the kind of controlled impact that her instructors at survival school would have awarded top marks. She hit the ground with bent knees and a rolling motion that absorbed the impact energy, then immediately began gathering her parachute canopy to prevent it from serving as a signal beacon for enemy forces who might be attempting to locate her position. "Phoenix is on the ground and mobile," she transmitted, using military terminology that indicated she had landed safely and was capable of independent movement. "I'm approximately 2 clicks northeast of the primary engagement area. Initiating evasion procedures." Major Morrison acknowledged her transmission while continuing to coordinate airstrikes against the remaining enemy positions. The F-16s under his command were systematically eliminating hostile forces with the kind of precision that modern guided weapons made possible. But the operation was revealing the true scope of the enemy ambush that had nearly succeeded in eliminating Thompson's Rangers. "Phoenix, be advised we're finding enemy positions throughout that valley system," Morrison transmitted. This was a major operation, not just a chance encounter. Stay low and move toward the extraction point we're designating now. The revelation that the ambush had been a large-scale operation, rather than an opportunistic attack, changed the entire context of the day's events. Someone had invested significant resources in planning and executing an operation designed to eliminate American forces, had positioned fighters and equipment throughout the region, had demonstrated the kind of tactical sophistication that suggested professional military training and outside support. Maya began moving through the rocky terrain with the stealth techniques she had learned in survival training, using available cover and concealment to mask her movement while navigating toward the extraction point that Morrison's flight was coordinating with ground forces. But she was acutely aware that enemy fighters might be attempting to locate and capture her, that her value as a prisoner would be enormous given her knowledge of F-22 capabilities and American tactical procedures. In the valley below, the Rangers were beginning to receive the ammunition and supply drops that would allow them to continue operations until extraction could be arranged. The battle that had begun as a routine patrol had evolved into a significant intelligence-gathering opportunity, as the enemy positions being overrun by American forces contained equipment and documents that would provide valuable insights into hostile capabilities and intentions. Corporal Kim, his arm wound now properly treated by the squad's medic, was photographing enemy equipment with the attention to detail that his background in information technology had taught him. Every weapon, every piece of communication equipment, every document or map could provide intelligence that might prevent future ambushes or reveal enemy operational patterns. "Sergeant, you need to see this," Kim called to Thompson, pointing to a sophisticated radio system that had been abandoned when Maya's aircraft impact scattered the enemy assault force. "This is way more advanced than anything we've seen from local fighters. Someone supplied these guys with professional-grade military communications." Thompson examined the equipment with the eye of a soldier who had seen similar systems in use by regular military forces around the world. The radio was manufactured to specifications that suggested government backing, professional procurement, and training that went far beyond what local insurgent groups typically possessed. "Vasquez, make sure we document everything here," Thompson ordered. This intelligence could be more important than anything else that happened today. But even as Thompson spoke, he knew that the day's most important legacy wouldn't be found in captured equipment or tactical intelligence. Maya Rodriguez had demonstrated something that couldn't be quantified in after-action reports or analyzed in intelligence assessments. She had shown what military service meant at its highest level, what it looked like when someone placed duty and sacrifice above personal survival, what happened when training and technology were combined with the kind of courage that couldn't be taught in schools. Maya's movement through the mountainous terrain was steady but cautious, as she navigated toward the extraction point while maintaining awareness of potential threats from enemy forces that might still be active in the region. Her emergency radio provided intermittent contact with Morrison's flight, but the mountainous terrain limited communication range and created dead zones where she was effectively isolated from friendly forces. "Razor 1, Phoenix," she transmitted, when she reached a ridge that offered better communication angles. "I'm approximately 1 click from the designated extraction point. No enemy contact so far, but I'm seeing signs of recent activity in this area." Morrison acknowledged her transmission while coordinating with the combat search and rescue forces that were organizing her extraction. The operation required careful timing and coordination, as rescue helicopters would be vulnerable to enemy fire during the critical moments when they were landing or taking off in contested territory. "Phoenix, extraction is inbound with heavy escort," Morrison replied. "ETA 15 minutes to your location. Find good cover and mark your position when you hear the helicopters approaching." 15 minutes felt like 15 hours to Maya as she found a defensive position among the rocks and waited for the sound of approaching helicopters. She had survived the air-to-air engagement, had successfully ejected from her damaged aircraft, had completed a perfect parachute landing, and had navigated through enemy territory without being detected. But the final phase of her survival depended on factors beyond her control: the skill of the rescue crews, the accuracy of enemy intelligence about her location, and the basic mathematics of whether friendly forces could reach her before hostile forces could locate her position. The sound of helicopters finally reached her ears just as the sun was beginning to set behind the western mountains, their distinctive rotor wash creating the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Maya activated her emergency beacon and prepared signal flares to mark her location for the rescue crews, who were risking their own lives to bring her home safely. 6 months after the battle in the Afghan valley that would become known as the Phoenix Incident, Captain Maya Rodriguez stood before a packed auditorium at the Air Force Academy, her dress blue uniform adorned with ribbons that told the story of courage under fire. The distinguished flying cross on her chest caught the overhead lights as she prepared to address the newest class of cadets, young men and women who had chosen to dedicate their lives to military service, but had yet to understand what that choice truly meant. "When I was sitting in these same seats 8 years ago," Maya began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium sound system, "I thought I understood what it meant to be a fighter pilot. I had read the books, studied the history, memorized the technical specifications of every aircraft in the inventory. I thought preparation was about knowledge, about training, about following procedures and executing missions according to doctrine." In the front row, Cadet First Class Sarah Chun hung on every word. The daughter of immigrant parents who had sacrificed everything to give their children opportunities in America, Sarah had dreamed of becoming a pilot since elementary school. Maya's story had become legendary at the academy, studied in leadership classes and ethics seminars as an example of decision-making under extreme pressure. "But knowledge and training only take you so far," Maya continued, her eyes scanning the faces of young people who would soon face their own moments of testing. "There comes a moment in every military career when you have to choose between what's safe and what's right, between following orders and following your conscience, between preserving yourself and protecting others." The auditorium was absolutely silent as Maya spoke, the kind of attention that comes when someone is sharing hard-won wisdom about subjects that matter more than grades or career advancement. These cadets would graduate in a matter of months, would take their commissions as second lieutenants, would assume responsibility for the lives and welfare of the men and women under their command. "On that day in Afghanistan, I had approximately 90 seconds to decide who I was going to be for the rest of my life," Maya said, her voice carrying the weight of memory and reflection. "I could follow my orders, engage the enemy fighters, and probably survive to fight another day. Or I could ignore those orders, support the Rangers who were about to be overrun, and likely die in the process." In the audience, Brigadier General Patricia Hayes watched with the pride of a mentor who had seen her protégé grow from a promising cadet into a warrior of exceptional courage and character. Hayes had been promoted to command of the Air Education and Training Command, a position that gave her responsibility for shaping the next generation of Air Force officers. But she had never forgotten the late-night conversation with Maya about choosing between orders and conscience. "The choice I made that day wasn't really about tactics or training or following procedures," Maya continued. "It was about understanding that some things are more important than personal survival, that military service means accepting responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond your own welfare." The Academy had invited Maya to speak as part of a leadership development program that sought to prepare cadets for the moral and ethical challenges they would face as officers. Her story had become a case study in military ethics, but Maya herself was more interested in the human dimensions of leadership under pressure than in abstract philosophical discussions. After her presentation, Maya walked across the academy, grounds where she had spent 4 years preparing for a career that had taken directions she never could have imagined. The mountains surrounding Colorado Springs reminded her of Afghanistan, but without the threat of enemy fire or the constant tension of combat operations. It was a peaceful reminder that military service, at its best, was about preserving the kind of environment where young people could pursue their dreams without fear. She was joined on her walk by Colonel Marcus Thompson, who had been promoted and assigned to the academy as an instructor in the Department of Military Studies. Thompson's Rangers had all survived the battle in the Afghan Valley, though several bore scars that would last a lifetime. The bond between Maya and the soldiers she had saved had evolved into a friendship that transcended the normal boundaries between Air Force and Army personnel. The cadets always ask the same questions, Thompson observed as they walked through the campus that had shaped both their careers. They want to know if you were scared, if you thought about the consequences, if you would make the same choice again. Maya smiled, remembering her own days as a cadet when everything seemed either black or white, when the complexities of military service could be reduced to simple formulas and clear-cut procedures. What do you tell them when they ask those questions? I tell them that being scared is normal, that anyone who isn't afraid in combat is either lying or mentally unstable, Thompson replied. But I also tell them that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to do what's right, despite being afraid. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a young woman in cadet uniform, her bearing suggesting someone accustomed to leadership responsibilities. Cadet Chun had requested permission to speak with Maya after the presentation, and her company commander had granted approval for the brief meeting. "Ma'am, I wanted to thank you for your presentation today," Chun said, executing a crisp salute that Maya returned with the precision expected of academy graduates. "I'm hoping to become a pilot after graduation, and your story has inspired me to think differently about what that means." Maya saw something of her younger self in the cadet's earnest expression, the combination of determination and uncertainty that characterized young people preparing for careers that would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. "What branch of flying are you hoping for, cadet?" "Fighters, ma'am. I want to be where I can make the biggest difference, where the mission matters most." The answer was both predictable and admirable, reflecting the kind of ambition and service orientation that the academy sought to develop in its graduates. But Maya remembered having similar aspirations, remembered believing that individual heroics and advanced technology could solve the complex problems that military forces faced around the world. "That's an admirable goal," Maya replied carefully. "But remember that making a difference isn't always about flying the most advanced aircraft or participating in the most dramatic missions. Sometimes the biggest difference comes from being where you're needed most, when you're needed most, regardless of what platform you're flying." The conversation continued for several more minutes, touching on career planning, technical training, and the personal qualities that successful military aviators needed to develop. But Maya found herself thinking about the larger implications of military service, about the ways that individual decisions could ripple outward to affect thousands of lives, about the responsibility that came with wearing the uniform of the United States Air Force. Later that evening, Maya attended a dinner hosted by the academy superintendent, where she was reunited with several classmates who had chosen different career paths within the Air Force. Major Jennifer Walsh had become a test pilot, pushing the boundaries of aerospace technology at Edwards Air Force Base. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Kim had specialized in intelligence operations, working behind the scenes to provide the information that made successful missions possible. "Maya, I have to ask," Walsh said over dessert, her voice carrying the comfortable informality of old friendships. "Do you ever regret making the choice you made that day? Your career could have been very different if you had followed orders." The question touched on something that Maya had wrestled with during the months of investigation and review that had followed the Phoenix incident. A formal inquiry had examined every aspect of her decision-making, had questioned her judgment, and her adherence to military discipline had forced her to defend choices made under extreme pressure in the space of seconds. "I've thought about that a lot," Maya replied honestly. "My career definitely took a different direction than I had planned. But I can't imagine living with myself if I had made a different choice, if I had let those Rangers die, because I was more concerned about following orders than fulfilling my responsibility as their guardian angel." The dinner conversation turned to other topics: career opportunities, technical developments, family news from classmates scattered around the world. Maya found herself thinking about the nature of military service and the ways that individual choices could define entire careers. She had joined the Air Force to serve her country and protect American interests, but her most important mission had been protecting 12 soldiers she had never met in a valley whose name most Americans couldn't pronounce. 3 days later, Maya reported to her new assignment at Nellis Air Force Base, where she had been selected to serve as an instructor pilot in the F-22 training program. The position represented both recognition of her exceptional flying skills and acknowledgement that her experience in combat could benefit the next generation of Raptor pilots. It was demanding work that required her to pass on not just technical knowledge but also the kind of judgment and decision-making capability that couldn't be learned from textbooks. Her first class of student pilots included officers from several different backgrounds, some fresh from undergraduate pilot training, others experienced aviators transitioning from different aircraft types. But they all shared the common goal of mastering the world's most advanced fighter aircraft while learning to make the kinds of decisions that Maya had faced over Afghanistan. Flying the F-22 is about more than managing advanced technology, Maya told her students during their first classroom session. It's about understanding that this aircraft gives you capabilities that come with enormous responsibility. Every time you strap on this jet, you're accepting responsibility for the lives of people who depend on American air power for their survival. Among her students was First Lieutenant David Santos, the younger brother of Specialist Maria Santos, who had served with Thompson's Rangers during the Phoenix incident. David had requested assignment to Maya's class specifically, hoping to learn from the pilot who had saved his sister's life in that Afghan valley. "My sister told me what happened that day," Santos said after class, his voice carrying the emotion of family bonds strengthened by shared military service. "She said you could have left them to die, could have saved yourself, but you chose to stay and fight. That choice changed everything for our family." Maya listened to the young lieutenants, words with the understanding that came from months of reflection on the consequences of individual decisions. The Phoenix incident had affected not just the immediate participants, but also their families, their communities, the broader military culture that defined acceptable standards of courage and sacrifice. "Your sister and the other Rangers earned their own survival that day," Maya replied. "I just provided some additional support when they needed it most." The real heroes were the soldiers on the ground who refused to quit, who kept fighting despite impossible odds. But even as Maya spoke the words, she knew that the distinction between individual heroism and collective effort was more complex than simple modesty would suggest. Military operations succeeded through the integration of individual courage, professional competence, advanced technology, and institutional support systems that made extraordinary achievements possible. Over the following months, Maya developed a training program that emphasized decision-making under pressure, moral courage, in combat situations, and the integration of individual skill with team-based operations. Her curriculum included case studies from military history, scenario-based exercises that replicated the kinds of impossible choices that combat pilots faced, and guest lectures from ground forces who had depended on air support during critical moments. The program attracted attention from throughout the Air Force, with senior leaders recognizing that Maya's approach to pilot training addressed gaps in traditional instruction that had become apparent through recent combat experiences. The Phoenix incident had demonstrated that technical proficiency, while essential, was insufficient preparation for the moral and ethical challenges that modern warfare presented to individual service members. "We're not just training people to fly airplanes," Maya explained to General Hayes during a program review session. "We're preparing them to make life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure, to balance competing priorities when there's no clear right answer, to accept responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond their personal welfare." The training program's reputation spread throughout the military aviation community, attracting observers from other services and international partners who were interested in understanding how the Air Force was integrating lessons learned from recent combat operations. Maya found herself briefing senior officials from the Pentagon, sharing her experiences with congressional staff members, and participating in academic conferences where military professionals and civilian scholars discussed the evolving nature of warfare. But the most meaningful recognition came from unexpected sources. Elena Vasquez, now a master sergeant stationed at Fort Bragg, sent Maya a photograph of her twin sons wearing Air Force t-shirts and toy pilot wings. The accompanying letter explained that the boys had decided they wanted to become pilots like Mama's guardian angel, and that their mother had told them stories about courage and sacrifice that would shape their understanding of military service for years to come. Private Collins, now Sergeant Collins after 2 more deployments and a series of commendations for his performance in combat, had requested assignment to a joint training exercise where he could meet Maya in person. The meeting took place at a base in Nevada, where Collins thanked Maya for giving him the opportunity to grow into the kind of soldier he had become. "That day in the valley changed everything for me," Collins told Maya as they sat in the base commissary, sharing coffee and conversation about military service and personal growth. "I realized that being scared was normal, but that courage meant doing your job anyway. I've carried that lesson through every mission since then." The stories from Thompson's Rangers were repeated throughout the military community, creating a narrative about courage under fire that influenced training programs, leadership development courses, and the broader military culture that defined acceptable standards of performance under pressure. Maya's decision to ignore orders and support the endangered soldiers had become a case study in moral courage that was discussed in service academies, war colleges, and professional military education programs around the world. 2 years after the Phoenix incident, Maya was selected for promotion to major and assignment as the deputy commander of the F-22 training squadron at Nellis. The position gave her broader responsibility for shaping the Air Force's approach to developing advanced fighter pilots, but also connected her with policy discussions about the future of military aviation and the role of human decision-making. In increasingly automated warfare systems, her office walls displayed photographs from her flying career, including images from her time as an academy cadet, her early assignments as a new pilot, and her current role as an instructor and leader. But the centerpiece was a photograph taken by a military journalist during the Phoenix incident aftermath, showing Maya standing beside the wreckage of her F-22 with Thompson's Rangers gathered around her. It was a reminder of the moment when everything she had trained for, everything she believed about military service, had been tested under the most demanding circumstances imaginable. The photograph had appeared in military publications around the world, accompanied by articles about courage under fire, the integration of air and ground operations, and the human dimensions of modern warfare. But Maya valued it primarily as a reminder of the soldiers whose lives had depended on her willingness to risk everything when they needed help most. One afternoon, while reviewing training schedules and curriculum updates, Maya received a visitor who represented the full circle of her military career. Cadet First Class Sarah Chun, now in her final semester at the academy, had requested permission to interview Maya for a research project about leadership in combat situations. "Ma'am, I've been studying the Phoenix incident for my senior thesis," Chun explained, her cadet uniform immaculate and her bearing reflecting 4 years of military training. "I'm particularly interested in how individual decisions can influence larger military operations and strategic outcomes." Maya welcomed the opportunity to discuss her experiences with someone who was preparing for the same kinds of responsibilities she had faced. Chun's questions were thoughtful and well-researched, reflecting the kind of intellectual preparation that the Academy sought to develop in future officers. "When you made the decision to ignore orders and support the Rangers, did you consider the broader implications beyond the immediate tactical situation?" Chun asked, taking careful notes as Maya responded. "In the moment, I was focused entirely on the Rangers who were about to be overrun," Maya replied honestly. "I didn't have time to consider strategic implications or career consequences. But I had been trained to understand that military service means accepting responsibility for protecting others, and that training guided my decision-making even under extreme pressure." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, covering topics ranging from military ethics to the evolution of warfare technology to the personal qualities that successful leaders needed to develop. Chun's questions demonstrated the kind of analytical thinking that would serve her well as a military officer. But Maya was most impressed by her genuine interest in understanding the human dimensions of military service. "Ma'am, I have one final question," Chun said as their interview concluded. "If you could change anything about that day, anything about the choices you made or the way events unfolded, what would it be?" Maya considered the question carefully, thinking about the months of investigation and review that had followed, the career implications of her decision to ignore direct orders, the lives that had been saved, and the precedent that had been established for future generations of military aviators. "I would change the circumstances that made those choices necessary," she finally replied. "I would prefer to live in a world where soldiers don't face impossible odds, where pilots don't have to choose between following orders and saving lives, where military service doesn't require people to risk everything for others. But since we don't live in that world, I'm grateful for the training and preparation that allowed me to do what needed to be done when it mattered most." Chun's thesis, completed several months later, earned recognition as the Outstanding Cadet Research Project of the Year. Her analysis of the Phoenix incident contributed to ongoing discussions about military ethics, leadership development, and the integration of individual courage with institutional effectiveness. More importantly, it represented the kind of thoughtful reflection on military service that Maya hoped to see in all future officers. The recognition extended far beyond academic circles. Maya was invited to speak at the annual Air Force Association conference, where her presentation about decision-making under pressure drew standing ovations from an audience of military professionals, defense contractors, and civilian leaders. She used the platform to advocate for training programs that emphasized moral courage alongside technical competence, arguing that future military effectiveness would depend on developing leaders who could make ethical decisions under extreme pressure. Technology continues to advance at an unprecedented rate, Maya told the conference audience, her voice carrying clearly through the convention center sound system. "We have aircraft, weapons, and communication systems that our predecessors could never have imagined. But at the end of the day, military effectiveness still depends on individual human beings making decisions under pressure, accepting responsibility for consequences, and choosing to do what's right even when it's difficult." The speech was recorded and distributed throughout the military education system, becoming part of the curriculum in leadership courses and professional development programs. Maya's story had evolved from a single incident in an Afghan valley to a broader narrative about the nature of military service and the responsibilities that came with wearing the uniform, but perhaps the most significant recognition came from an unexpected source. The families of Thompson's Rangers had organized an annual reunion, bringing together the soldiers who had served together during that deployment, along with their spouses, children, and extended family members. Maya had been invited to attend as the guest of honor, representing the Air Force personnel who had supported the Rangers during their most dangerous mission. The reunion took place at a hotel in San Antonio, chosen because it was Elena Vasquez's hometown and convenient for most of the participants. Maya arrived to find herself surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by the events in that Afghan valley. Not just the Rangers themselves, but their families, their children, the communities that had welcomed them home. "Captain Rodriguez," said Vasquez's mother, using Maya's rank from the time of the incident rather than her current major's insignia. "My daughter has told me so much about what you did for her and her soldiers. I want you to know that our entire family prays for you every Sunday at Mass." The words carried the weight of generational gratitude that extended far beyond the immediate participants in the Phoenix incident. Maya realized that her decision on that day in Afghanistan had affected not just 12 soldiers, but dozens of family members who might have lost sons, daughters, parents, or siblings if the battle had ended differently. Throughout the reunion weekend, Maya heard stories about how the experience had shaped the Rangers' subsequent military careers and civilian pursuits. Several had chosen to remain in the Army, advancing to senior non-commissioned officer positions where they passed on lessons learned from combat to younger soldiers. Others had returned to civilian life, but maintained connections to military service through reserve units, veteran organizations, or community programs that supported deployed troops. Corporal Kim had completed his military service and used the GI Bill to finish his computer science degree, eventually founding a technology company that developed software for military applications. But he credited his time in Afghanistan, and specifically the Phoenix incident, with teaching him about leadership under pressure and the importance of making decisions based on values rather than convenience. "I learned something that day that no business school could have taught me," Kim told Maya during a quiet moment at the reunion. "I learned that real leadership means being willing to sacrifice for others, even when the sacrifice doesn't benefit you personally. That lesson has guided every major decision I've made since then." Private Collins, now a civilian working as a police officer in Michigan, had applied the lessons learned in Afghanistan to his law enforcement career. His experience with Maya's courage under fire had influenced his approach to dangerous situations, teaching him that sometimes the right choice was also the most difficult choice. "I've been in situations where I had to choose between staying safe and protecting others," Collins explained to Maya. "Every time, I remember watching your F-22 diving toward those enemy positions, even though you knew you might not survive. That memory has helped me make the right choice every time." The stories continued throughout the weekend, each one demonstrating how a single incident had rippled outward to influence lives and careers in ways that Maya had never anticipated. The Phoenix incident had become more than a military operation. It had become a teaching moment that continued to shape people's understanding of courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility years after the smoke had cleared. 5 years after the Phoenix incident, Colonel Maya Rodriguez stood on the observation deck of the Pentagon, watching F-22 Raptors practice aerial maneuvers over the Virginia countryside. Her promotion to colonel had come with assignment to the Air Staff, where she served as a special advisor on pilot training and combat readiness. The position gave her influence over policy decisions that would affect thousands of military aviators, but she never forgot that her expertise had been earned in the crucible of combat, rather than in academic institutions or think tanks. The view from the Pentagon reminded Maya of the perspective she had gained during her combat career, the ability to see larger patterns while remaining focused on individual human stories, the understanding that strategic decisions ultimately affected people rather than abstract concepts, the recognition that military service was fundamentally about protecting others rather than advancing personal interests. Her office in the Pentagon housed a collection of artifacts from her military career, including the flight helmet she had worn during the Phoenix incident, now cracked and scarred from her emergency ejection, but preserved as a reminder of the day when everything she had trained for was tested under the most demanding circumstances possible. Visitors often asked about the helmet, providing Maya with opportunities to discuss the human dimensions of military service with civilian leaders and international partners who needed to understand how individual courage contributed to national security. The most advanced technology in the world is only as effective as the people who operate it, Maya would explain to Pentagon visitors, using her helmet as a visual aid to illustrate the relationship between human factors and military effectiveness. This helmet protected my head during an ejection from a $2 billion aircraft, but the real protection came from training, preparation, and the willingness to accept responsibility for consequences that extended far beyond my personal survival. The discussions often led to broader conversations about military culture, professional development, and the ways that individual decisions could influence strategic outcomes. Maya had become recognized as an expert on leadership under pressure, frequently called upon to brief senior officials about lessons learned from recent combat operations and their implications for future military planning. But her most important work continued to involve direct interaction with the military personnel who would implement whatever policies emerged from Pentagon planning sessions. Maya had established a mentorship program that connected experienced combat veterans with junior officers preparing for their first deployments, ensuring that lessons learned in places like Afghanistan were passed on to the next generation of military leaders. The program had expanded to include officers from all services and had attracted international participation from allied nations, seeking to improve their own military education systems. Maya found herself regularly traveling to military academies, war colleges, and training centers around the world, sharing her experiences with audiences that represented the global military community. During one such visit to the Royal Air Force College in England, Maya met Wing Commander Elizabeth Harrison, a British pilot who had faced similar ethical dilemmas during operations in Syria. Harrison's story involved choosing between mission objectives and civilian protection, a decision that had saved hundreds of lives, but violated direct orders from higher command. "Your Phoenix incident has become a case study for us," Harrison explained during a private conversation after Maya's presentation to RAF cadets. "We use it to teach our pilots about moral courage and the importance of making ethical decisions even when they conflict with immediate tactical objectives." The international recognition of Maya's story demonstrated how individual acts of courage could transcend national boundaries and cultural differences, creating shared narratives about military service that influenced training programs and leadership development throughout the allied military community. Maya's decision in that Afghan valley had become part of the broader military tradition that connected warriors across time and geography. 10 years after the Phoenix incident, Maya received notification that she had been selected for promotion to Brigadier General, making her one of the youngest officers ever to achieve that rank in the Air Force. The promotion ceremony took place at Nellis Air Force Base, where her career as an instructor pilot had prepared her for the broader responsibilities that came with general officer rank. The ceremony attendees included military personnel from throughout Maya's career, but the place of honor was reserved for the Rangers whose lives she had saved during that desperate battle in Afghanistan. Now senior non-commissioned officers and junior officers themselves, Thompson's squad had maintained their connections to each other and to Maya through years of military service and civilian pursuits. Sergeant Major Elena Vasquez, now the senior enlisted leader for an Army training brigade, delivered remarks that placed Maya's promotion in the context of military tradition and service to others. Her words carried the authority of someone who had experienced combat, leadership firsthand, and understood the qualities that distinguish true leaders from people who simply wore rank insignia. General Rodriguez represents the best traditions of American military service, Vasquez said, her voice carrying clearly through the desert air of Nevada. She demonstrated that real leadership means being willing to sacrifice for others, that courage means doing what's right even when it's difficult, that military service is ultimately about protecting people rather than advancing personal interests. Promotion ceremony was followed by a reception that brought together military personnel, civilian leaders, and family members who had been touched by Maya's story. Her father, now retired but still proud of his daughter's achievements, wore a suit that he had purchased specifically for the occasion. His eyes filled with tears as he watched Maya receive her first star, remembering the little girl who had dreamed of flying airplanes and grown up to save lives in distant mountains. "Mia," he whispered to Maya during a quiet moment at the reception, "you have flown higher than I ever dreamed possible. But more importantly, you have used your wings to lift others." The words captured something essential about Maya's career and the way her story had influenced others. The Phoenix incident had demonstrated that individual decisions could have far-reaching consequences, that military service required moral courage alongside technical competence, that the most advanced technology was only as effective as the people who operated it with wisdom and integrity. 15 years after the Phoenix incident, General Rodriguez was serving as the commander of Air Education and Training Command, responsible for developing the pilots, maintainers, and support personnel who would serve in the Air Force for the next generation. The position represented the culmination of a career that had been defined by a single moment of decision-making under extreme pressure, but had grown to encompass broader responsibilities for shaping military culture and professional development. Her headquarters at Joint Base San Antonio Randolph housed a museum dedicated to the history of military aviation, including exhibits about the evolution of fighter aircraft, the development of pilot training programs, and the stories of aviators who had distinguished themselves in combat. Maya had contributed artifacts from her own career, but she insisted that the Phoenix incident exhibit focus on the Rangers whose lives had been saved rather than on her individual actions. "Military service is fundamentally about teamwork," Maya explained to museum visitors, using the exhibit as a teaching tool about the integration of air and ground operations. The Phoenix incident succeeded because everyone involved, pilots, ground forces, support personnel, understood their responsibilities and executed their missions with courage and competence. The museum attracted visitors from throughout the military community and beyond, including school groups, veteran organizations, and international delegations interested in understanding American military culture and training methods. Maya often served as a personal guide for VIP visitors, using the exhibits to discuss larger themes about military service, ethical decision-making, and the development of leadership qualities. During one such visit, a group of high school students from East Los Angeles toured the museum as part of a program designed to introduce young people to military career opportunities. Maya recognized something of her younger self in several of the students, the combination of ambition and uncertainty that characterized young people from challenging backgrounds who were considering military service as a path to opportunity and purpose. "General Rodriguez," asked one student, a young woman whose bearing suggested natural leadership potential, "what advice would you give to someone who wants to become a military pilot but isn't sure if they're brave enough?" The question touched on something fundamental about military service and the relationship between courage and preparation. Maya had learned that bravery wasn't the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite fear, that military effectiveness depended on training and preparation rather than natural fearlessness. "Courage isn't something you're born with," Maya replied, addressing not just the questioner, but the entire group of students. "It's something you develop through training, through preparation, through understanding your responsibilities to others. The military will teach you to be brave by giving you the skills and knowledge you need to make good decisions under pressure. The conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from academic preparation to physical fitness, to the personal qualities that successful military personnel needed to develop. Maya found herself thinking about her own journey from the streets of East LA to the general officer ranks, recognizing that every step had been supported by mentors, colleagues, and family members who had believed in her potential. 20 years after the Phoenix incident, Maya's story had become integrated into military culture in ways that extended far beyond her individual career. The incident was studied in service academies, war colleges, and professional military education programs as an example of ethical decision-making under extreme pressure. Her approach to pilot training had influenced curriculum development throughout the Air Force and had been adopted by international partners seeking to improve their own military education systems. But perhaps the most significant legacy was found in the careers of the people Maya had mentored, trained, and influenced throughout her military service. Hundreds of pilots had learned to fly under her instruction, had absorbed lessons about courage and moral responsibility that would guide their decisions in future conflicts. Thousands of military personnel had heard her speak about leadership and service, carrying those lessons to their own assignments and responsibilities around the world. The ripple effects continued to spread through personal relationships, family stories, and professional networks that connected the military community across generations. Maya's decision in that Afghan valley had become part of a larger narrative about military service that influenced how people understood courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility in contexts far removed from combat operations. The Phoenix incident had also influenced technological development and tactical doctrine within the Air Force. Maya's experience had demonstrated the importance of maintaining human decision-making authority in advanced weapon systems, leading to modifications in F-22 design and operation that preserved pilot autonomy in critical situations. Her story had become part of the argument for continued human involvement in military operations, despite advances in automation and artificial intelligence. 30 years after the Phoenix incident, retired General Maya Rodriguez returned to the Air Force Academy as a visiting professor, teaching courses on military ethics and leadership development. Her classroom walls displayed photographs from throughout her career, but the centerpiece remained the image of her standing with Thompson's Rangers beside the wreckage of her F-22 in that Afghan valley. The students in her classes represented a new generation of military officers who had grown up hearing stories about the Phoenix incident, who understood Maya's story as part of the military tradition they were preparing to join. But she challenged them to think beyond individual heroics toward broader questions about military service, ethical decision-making, and responsibility to others. The Phoenix incident wasn't about one pilot making a dramatic choice, Maya told her students during the final lecture of the semester. It was about understanding that military service means accepting responsibility for protecting others, that courage means doing what's right even when it's difficult, that individual decisions can have consequences that extend far beyond personal survival. As her lecture concluded, Maya looked out at the faces of young people who would soon take their places in the long tradition of American military service. Some would become pilots, others would serve in different specialties, but all would face moments when their training, their character, and their understanding of military service would be tested under pressure. You will face your own Phoenix moments, Maya said, her voice carrying the authority of experience and the weight of tradition. When those moments come, remember that you are part of something larger than yourself, that your decisions affect people you may never meet, that military service is ultimately about protecting the values and freedoms that make our society worth defending. The students filed out of the classroom, carrying with them lessons about courage, sacrifice, and moral responsibility that would guide them through careers that none of them could yet fully imagine. Maya remained behind, straightening her lecture. Notes and thinking about the continuity of military tradition that connected her story to countless others throughout American history. Outside her classroom window, F-22 Raptors practiced formation flying over the Colorado mountains, their sleek forms cutting through the afternoon sky with the precision that had made American air power the most capable in the world. Maya watched the aircraft with the satisfaction of someone who had contributed to both their technical development and the training of the pilots who flew them. As the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded Maya of the desert landscapes where her story had begun, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the streets of East Los Angeles to the halls of the Air Force Academy. Every step had been supported by people who believed in the importance of military service, who understood that individual courage could make a difference in the lives of others, who recognized that some things were worth risking everything to protect. The legacy of the Phoenix incident would continue long after Maya's own story had ended, carried forward by the pilots she had trained, the students she had taught, the military culture she had helped to shape. In the end, that legacy was not about advanced technology or dramatic aerial combat, but about the fundamental human qualities that made military service both necessary and noble: courage, sacrifice, and the willingness to put the welfare of others above personal survival. The Rangers were safe. The mission was complete. The tradition would continue. Subscribe to She Carried Honor, where silence is never forgotten.